dash runs report to the third table. All 60-meter dash runs report to the third table. Thank you.
Crouching at the starting line.
Set.
The lead leg hurdling technique. Things that are so standard at a track meet, we hardly even notice them. But these clever innovations were not always around. An athlete and his coach brought them forward at the start of the 20th century. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, late 1800s. A young man named Alvin Krensline practiced running in the basement of East Side High School, but his heart was heavy. Alvin's father, who worked in the brewery business, had abandoned his wife and children years prior.
I don't know why he left. I think it was to start another brewery. That was one reason that I think he said, but he never did come back.
Alvin's older brother Hugo worked at the Pabst Brewery and became the family patriarch. As far as anyone knows, Alvin never spoke to his father again. In 1895, Alvin traveled 90 miles west for college at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He majored in engineering, ran on the indoor track at the modern new gym, and became an athletic star. One of the country's preeminent coaches, 36-year-old Mike Murphy, took notice. Murphy was building a powerhouse at the University of Pennsylvania. The coach convinced Alvin to transfer to Penn. Arriving on the stately campus in 1897, Alvin switched majors to dentistry and saw his track and field talent further explode. Headline after headline crowed about his performances. Newspaper cartoonists even showed the competition panting, while Krensline cruised. Murphy would go on to write several books about athletic techniques, including his ahead-of-their-time beliefs that athletes needed whole-body nutrition and proper rest.
He was really pretty beloved by his athletes. He was not a martinet type of coach or trainer like, many of the football coaches would be in that era. His athletes generally loved him. In training, he was one of the first ones who used liniment, rubbing oils and things like that, and gave athletes massage.
But perhaps Murphy's greatest contribution was showing runners a new way to gain acceleration from their legs.
I think, the thing he's most known for is teaching sprinters the crouch start. Before they just sort of stood up, sort of half bent over and started like that, like an 800-meter runner does now. But he got them to put either one hand down or two hands down in the start and start in a crouch position, somewhat like a football lineman does.
Murphy was a master craftsman, but had to overcome his own physical disability. He was hard of hearing.
What I've heard is he was not deaf where he couldn't hear anything. He was just very hard of hearing, which in that era was a difficult thing because there weren't hearing aids yet. So he, could not hear a lot. He was not born deaf or anything like that. That was a sort of an acquired hard of hearing. So he spoke okay. He could communicate by speaking to the athletes.
About this same time, Krensline popularized another important element in track. He tinkered with the idea of how to stay in stride going over a hurdle by thrusting one leg forward. Prior to that, most people would either hop over it or use a crude scissors kick.
He was the first one to use a straight leg out in front of him and then, sort of bend his trail leg behind him as he went over it, which is a much more efficient way to do it.
Murphy was chosen to be the trainer for the 1900 Olympics, and Krensline was one of his athletes. They traveled with a contingent to Paris. It was only the second modern Olympics and was run mostly as a sideshow to the World's Fair.
They were very strange Olympics. They were held over about a 6-month period, from May through November, or through October at least, I think into early November. There were hundreds of events.
Track and field took place at a park in less than ideal conditions.
It wasn't held on a track. There was a grass. They set up a track on grass, and that's what they ran on. And in fact, the discus throw, the throwers had to throw between two stands of trees, and some of the throws actually they threw them into the trees so they couldn't count. So I mean, it's unbelievably different than today.
Hurdles back then were heavy, many made out of 2x4s. In Paris, those in the steeplechase had to leap over sawed-off telephone poles. But despite all of it, Elvin won 4 gold medals: the 110-meter high hurdles, 200-meter low hurdles, 60-meter sprint, and long jump. His 4 individual golds remain an Olympic track and field record. Yet the long jump caused a controversy with one of his American teammates.
Well, Meyer Prinstein was a great sprinter and jumper from Syracuse University from the U.S., and he was considered Cranesline's great rival in the long jump, at least.
Most athletes at the time did not compete on Sundays for religious reasons. Although Prinstein was himself Jewish, he entered into a gentleman's agreement not to compete in the long jump finals on Sunday. Prinstein thought Cranesline had also agreed not to jump.
However, Cranesline ended up competing on the next day, and he ended up surpassing Prinstein's mark by 1/4 of an inch, just barely beating him. So effectively, he won the gold medal with that, and this made Prinstein irate. Most of the stories that talk about it say Prinstein came over and punched Cranesline because of that. There are some people who say he never actually got to punch him. They were separated before he got to him, but I sort of believe that he punched him.
There is no record of Elvin's thoughts on the matter, and his reasons for jumping are lost to time. But the 4 gold medals made Cranesline a critically important figure.
He's the only track and field athlete in Olympic history to win 4 individual gold medals at the same Olympic Games. Nobody's done it since. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals in 1936, but 1 was in a relay. Carl Lewis won 4 gold medals in 1984, but 1 was in a relay.
Yet Elvin Cranesline never competed again. After the Olympics, he returned home and met Claudine, his future wife. Entire front pages were dedicated to their romance. Giving up dentistry for coaching, Elvin notably worked for the University of Michigan, Germany, and Cuba. However, the German coaching stint was interrupted by war.
He was invited by the Kaiser Wilhelm just before the First World War to come over to train his Olympic team. And they all, my mother and my grandmother and Cranesline, went to Berlin. My mother always sort of liked to tell me that she'd had tea with a prince. The Kaiser told Cranesline to leave because war was going to break out, that he better leave. So everybody left and came back here. But they were there for about a year. And then this young prince went to the Russian front, and he was unfortunately killed there. But he wrote my grandfather 2 or 3 letters, which I still have.
In 1920, back in the States, Elvin took his teenage daughter, named Claudine like her mother, on a cross-country road trip. They stopped to milk cows and camped every night.
They would lie down at night looking up at the stars, and you can just imagine how beautiful that was, with no highway noise, dirt roads all the way. She was very proud of her father. Really, I can't stress that enough. She was so proud. When I think about my mother's life and all the things that she did and the connections that she had, and then I look at Franklin Field at Penn and I think, oh my gosh, it's still there. You know, it's still there.
Elvin Cranesline was posthumously inducted into the USA Olympic Hall of Fame in the 1980s. There, Susanna spoke with another great hurdler, Edwin Moses.
I asked him if he knew about Cranesline, and he said no. He never. Here he was doing a sport, and he didn't know how the way he did it originated, and that surprised me a great deal. And I thought, that's not right.
Moses wasn't the only one. Despite enormous contributions, Elvin Cranesline and Mike Murphy are not well known. In fact, one of Murphy's children went on to higher fame.
His youngest son, George Murphy, became a Hollywood actor. He was a vaudeville song and dance man who went on to Hollywood and started with Shirley Temple in Little Miss Broadway. He did Battleground, and then later became a United States Senator from California.
Dan LaFave keeps boxes of memorabilia about his great-grandfather in his Illinois basement. Dan's grandmother, Mabel, was Mike Murphy's daughter.
She was full of wonderful stories about so many different things. From an early age, I knew that, you know, her dad had been an Olympic coach and a famous trainer, and that he was the inventor of the crouch start.
Alvin's granddaughter, Susanna, age 81, lives in Pennsylvania. In Ohio, you'll find Susanna's sister, Bodil, who is 90. A third granddaughter, Bettina, resides in California. None of them ever met Alvin. He died just a few years before the eldest, Bodil, was born. Bodil has been deaf almost her entire life. Through an interpreter, she tells us of one of her proudest moments, running a leg of the Olympic torch relay before the 1996 Olympics.
I remember being so thrilled about it and honoring my grandfather in doing so, to be there. Yes, it was exciting. There were many people lined up on the streets, and there was actually an interpreter with me. I saved the soot from the torch, and some of the people would wash it off, but I didn't. I kept the soot on my torch and left it in there.
The three granddaughters were born in Denmark, where their father was from. They were only vaguely aware as children of their famous grandfather and his many accomplishments.
My mother decided to allow us to play with his medals. At that time, we were ready to move to, moving from Denmark to the United States at that time. So I asked my mother, "Where are the medals?" And she said, "I'm sorry, I had to sell them to get money to pay for the boat trip."
Sadly, both Murphy and Krensline died young. Murphy in 1913 at age 52 from tuberculosis.
I understand that between his house and the church that apparently there were a couple of thousand people that lined the way.
Alvin passed 15 years later in 1928 at age 51 from heart problems. But the contributions of these two men will never leave us.
In Murphy's case, he was the greatest track and field coach probably before World War I.
My great-grandfather's motto, I guess, had been, "You can't lick a team that won't be licked."
Krensline was probably the greatest track and field athlete in the United States until Jim Thorpe came along in 1912. He just wasn't as well known. He sort of had a meteoric career. He started winning AAU titles and IC4A titles in 1897, and then he had the 1900 Olympics. That was it, a 3-year career, and he was gone. He went into dental practice and then coached. So, you know, people don't remember him very well, but again, before Jim Thorpe, he was the greatest American track and field star.
Well, when I found out that he was my mother's father, I mean, I was surprised by that. I was very proud about him, yes.
There's no question that Alvin and Mike were special, and their love of athletics and the Olympic spirit have passed down.
I like to watch track when the Olympics are on, the Summer Olympics. I do, because of my grandfather.
All of the descendants only wish they could have met their own ancestors, the men who forever altered the sports landscape. What would Susanna say to her grandfather now, if she had the chance?
"I'm sorry I missed you. I'm sorry I missed you being alive."
Alvin has been called the father of hurdling, and Murphy the father of track and field. You have to wonder if Murphy also became a father figure to Alvin, whose own dad had abandoned him. More than a century after those Paris Olympics, every sprinter and hurdler still employs the techniques pioneered by these two men.
Krensline had the innovative straight leg technique. Murphy started the crouch start, which was a big innovation for sprinters. And what they did influenced track and field basically through the 20th century.